Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be analysing 5 different periods of significance in First Nations history through visual representations in the media. I will touch on the historical significance of each piece, what it represents regarding common attitudes during that time, and provide key analysis of each image. I would firstly like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, the Ngunnawal Ngambri people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening. This first image is Australian black stealing on a shepherd, the Illustrated Sydney News, September 29, 1869. Australia, which was not yet federated, was seeing changes in the political climate regarding Indigenous Australians, namely with the writing of the Aboriginal Protection Act in Victoria of 1869. The combination of this image and the Act, which passed in the same year, perpetuated the ideology that First Nations Australians were not equal people, which is seen through the reference of them as blacks. This image supports the suggestion that First Nations resistance was a crime in its nature, supported by the word stealing. The Indigenous people in this image are nude, carrying sharpened spears and crouched low in the scrub behind the shepherd, suggesting stalking or lurking. Their sticks are raised, suggesting they are poised to attack. There are multiple First Nations individuals approaching a single sleeping shepherd, which automatically puts them in a position of power. This suggests that the Indigenous people were seeking violence against white Australians who were not welcoming of this behaviour, and the fact that the shepherd is asleep suggests that he wasn't even expecting this. The purpose of this image is to fuel fear and anger in white Australian readers. It acts as a divisive mechanism to drive a wedge between the two communities. It also acted as a supporting pillar to the Aboriginal Protection Act. First Nations viewers would be strongly impacted by this image, not only because it depicts them as somewhat evil and violent, but it reminds them of a time where they could live in their traditional ways, wear what they wanted to wear, behave how they wanted to behave. This second image is the Jeddah film poster from 1955. The film was produced during the forced assimilation period of colonisation, where the government aimed to absorb First Nations people into white society through suppression, child removal, and social and cultural control. First Nations people were not regarded as citizens at this time and were subjected to the policies under the Protection Act of 1869, and the film Jeddah embodies those values. In the film, Jeddah is a First Nations child who is raised by white pastoralists and is forbidden from learning her language or culture. Her adoptive mother insists on raising her white, which obviously assimilates her into that culture. She feels drawn to Marbuk, which is the young First Nations man in this image, and it is clearly suggested that this is a terrible move, as per the two descriptions on the image, which are, "It was death for him to look on this girl," and "A story of Eve in ebony." Jeddah promotes the stereotype of First Nations people as primitive, emotional, and other. Marbuk is dignified yet driven by tribal instinct and uncontrollable passion. It suggests that white culture and First Nations culture could not cohabitate or coexist. First Nations viewers would find Jeddah a catalyst for complex emotions, pride in seeing Kunoth and Tutawali star in a motion picture, but also pain at the distorted portrayal of their culture. For non-First Nations audiences, the film likely reinforced beliefs that assimilation was positive and necessary, and that cross-cultural unity could only occur through the dissolution of First Nations identity. The third image is from the Australian newspaper, which depicts Ruby Hammond and politician Andrew Jones on the day of the voting for the Yes campaign. This is in May 1967. The image represents the referendum era, which is a time of political and social change for First Nations people who had suffered under the pre-existing assimilation policy. The button reading "Vote Yes for Aborigines" visually captures the unifying message of equality and reform that was rapidly spreading throughout Australian society. Ruby Hammond is a well-respected and well-known First Nations activist, and she is shown engaging with a white politician, which is a striking reverse from the previous image, in which First Nations people were depicted as passive and subordinate. The image rejects racial stereotypes previously perpetuated, which through its portrayal of Hammond as politically engaged, intelligent, and articulate. The purpose of this image is to promote the political campaign that brought on political change. It encouraged Australians to vote yes in the referendum by portraying cross-cultural collaboration as a positive thing. It seeks to humanise First Nations Australians after decades of reducing them to the margins of society. For First Nations viewers, this image represents empowerment, visibility, and collective action, a small glimpse into the acknowledgement and activism that was fought for so very long. This fourth image depicts Kevin Rudd embracing a member of the Stolen Generation following his apology on National Sorry Day, 13th of February 2008. This image is part of the reconciliation era of 21st century Australia. It was a time of political and cultural shifts which acknowledged the trauma of past policies and the continued suffering of First Nations individuals. The physical embrace between Kevin Rudd and the elder symbolises a rare moment of unity and compassion between the government and the First Nations communities. The elder's gesture is warm, offering an intimate, tender embrace, and Kevin Rudd appears solemn and reverent, which reflects the gravity of the situation. The image overtly challenges pre-existing stereotypes. It replaces notions of separation and subjugation with connection, recognition, and empathy. The purpose of this image is to visually encapsulate the repentance and empathy expressed in the apology. It conveys the spirit of his words. We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering, and loss. First Nations viewers would see this image as a representative of the long-awaited validation of a long-understood truth. This is a symbolic acknowledgement of suffering that generations of First Nations people have fought for. For white Australians, it evokes empathy and understanding and encourages us to reflect on our colonial legacy. This final image depicts a young First Nations woman at an Invasion Day protest, wearing traditional markings and holding a First Nations flag, circa 2017. This image represents modern First Nations activism and media representation during what we are now coining the recognition era, wherein First Nations people reclaim their voice, visibility, and power in national conversations. The face paint suggests deep cultural continuity, which is a visual rejection of assimilation. The determined expression, raised flag, and throngs of surrounding protesters demonstrate unity, pride, and resilience. This image also directly defies stereotypes of First Nations being passive or subscribing to victimhood. It presents First Nations Australians as active agents for change. The purpose of this image is to document and humanise First Nations activism, capturing the strength, pride, and determination of First Nations youth. It challenges mainstream media's historic portrayal of First Nations people as marginalised. For First Nations viewers, the image represents empowerment, solidarity, and reinforces pride in identity and belonging. It connects cultural heritage with activism and reminds us that protest is part of survival. It asks all Australians to unite to finally bridge the gap between our colonial past and our united future. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to discussing this with you again soon. Thank you.